Hi everybody and welcome back to Stripe Sessions. And here I'm joined by Michelle Bu, who is the Principal Product Architect here at Stripe. And this is going to be an amazing session because we're going to be talking about API v2 and you. But also Michelle's been here a very, very long time at Stripe and has deep, deep insights into API development. So Michelle, welcome to our show. How are you doing here today at Sessions?
Great. It is loud out there.
It's pretty loud out there.
Yeah.
In the middle of the expo hall. Yeah.
We're in the middle of the expo hall.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm going to start with a question that I think a lot of people have, which is API v2. Is this something I have to do? I'm on v1, I'm very happy. Do I really have to pick up v2 as a concept?
No. That's the short answer. I guess the longer answer is if you think about v1 and v2, they're kind of just namespaces that we organize our APIs under. And one of the rationales for switching to a v2 namespace, or for cutting a v2 namespace, is that there are some new API semantics that we wanted to adopt. And so we felt like it would be clearer to indicate that with the v2 namespace. So APIs in the v1 namespace will have a certain set of semantics that we all know and love. And then v2 will have a new set of semantics that will power the next generation of Stripe APIs. But v1 is not going away. Those APIs will continue to work. And in fact, we are intentionally designing it so that v1 APIs and v2 APIs will work together. So you can use both of them, and you can get the functionality you want from v1 as well as the new stuff we're shipping on v2 and use them seamlessly with one integration.
Yeah, so there's no API v3 in the works that we have to run towards.
Maybe in 10 years.
Yeah. So what sort of developer feedback led you to the creation of v2 when you rewind the clock when it's just an early idea?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think this is more driven by some of our own need to evolve a lot of our core domain models. So I started at Stripe 12 years ago, and back then we only had a few dozen endpoints. We didn't have that much functionality. And today we have over 500 different endpoints across so many different product suites. And honestly, one of the things that we were struggling with in API design is how do you organize all of these resources? And so you see a lot of our core resources from back in 2012, 2011, like the charge, the token. They're all still just top level in the v1 resource, or sorry, in the v1 namespace. But then you see some of the more modern products that we've shipped, like issuing or billing, and you'll see more nesting in the v1 namespace. And so we started finding it harder to reason about what things actually work together. So do the things in the top level namespace work together with the things in the nested namespace? How do you reason about the relationship between these products and these API endpoints and objects? And so v2 has actually a more thoughtful way of grouping some of these API resources. So there's v2 core, where we put all of the domain models and APIs that should work with everything in v2 into that particular namespace. We also have v2 billing, where all of our new billing features live. We are introducing v2 money management, where that will live. And so I guess it's less user feedback and more we are scaling our API development and scaling how we're organizing all of these endpoints and how we think about them.
So if you're just joining us right now, I'm with Michelle Bu, who's a Principal Product Architect here at Stripe, talking about API v2. If you have any questions or comments for Michelle, just drop them in the comments, and I can pick them up here, and we can chat about them. So just thinking about, you're in a really rare position because you came to Stripe when it was a very small company compared to what it is today, and you've navigated this pretty much by yourself, whereas in many companies, these are changing roles of people working on APIs. And I think this is really insightful for what that means for startups, so many of our customers. When you were back in those days, if you cast your mind back, what do you think is a good time to start thinking about scale? Because it's obviously not that important in the very beginning, but it becomes important. What's your take on that?
Interesting. What do you mean by scale?
Well, when you first start, you might not realize you're going to become the scale that Stripe is at today. Yeah. And if you build that in early, it might be too early. But of course, if you leave it too late, then it will fall over.
Yeah, interesting. I think actually we started thinking about scale pretty early on. Like even back in 2013 when I first joined, we had a versioning system. So we were already thinking about how do we make breaking changes to our API, how do we think about backwards compatibility, how do we incrementally ship new features without affecting existing integration. So even back then, we kind of knew the importance of having a system that would grow with our users, because we know that because Stripe is financial infrastructure and payments infrastructure, we can't break, right? We can't break your integration. So even back then, we were pretty thoughtful about how we introduce new features and what sorts of platforms we were building to help support things like versioning. And I would say even when I joined, we already had what I would call API review, where every single change to the API had to go through, at the time it wasn't really a process, it was more like a couple of us sitting around couches over drinks and discussing API naming and things like that. But we always had some sort of like discussion about what was going into the API before we made those changes. It was never like one engineer just decided to ship a new API. We had a lot of discussions about every single little field name, every single parameter name. We had discussions about like spellings in the API. Should we use like British English or American English? And you can imagine, like, as we're designing new state machines, like payment intents, we had hours of discussion on, like, what is the state machine that will scale to all the local payment methods that we want to add to payment intents in the future, for instance. And so even early on, I think we understood the importance of those design decisions, and so we considered them very carefully, and we made sure that those design decisions would then scale to the next set of things that we were building.
Yeah, I mean, before I worked at Stripe, I was a Stripe customer very early on, and it struck me compared to other platforms and other services, just how well thought out the API was. You know, I think part of the developer love comes from the fact that it's very consumable as a developer.
Yeah.
And it struck me, even years ago, just how unusual that was for such a platform.
Yeah, absolutely. There's like a couple of principles that we keep in mind as we're designing APIs. First, self-serve is so important. We want developers to be able to just read our documentation, be able to get up and running. We used to have test mode, now sandboxes, but it's so important that we make sure that every feature we build works in a test environment in addition to the live environment. And I think that's something that often is an afterthought for some API companies, but for us, it is at the forefront of how we think about designing these APIs. And another term that we use sometimes is like minimum viable complexity. So we want to make sure that we are abstracting away a lot of the gory details of the underlying payment networks and all the things that you shouldn't have to think about as you're building your payments integration. But of course, as Stripe has scaled, our developers and our users have scaled as well in their needs. And so we've found that we do need to actually expose some of those more advanced features in the API. And so another term that we use is a careful reveal. So you are coming into Stripe, it's very easy to get started. Everything's like very conveniently packaged for you. But then we do have to carefully reveal those additional advanced details to you as you grow to need them and as your business starts to need them. So easy to get started, but then we like carefully reveal that complexity over time. And we kind of think about that throughout all of our API designs.
That's been something that's interesting to me joining this company as well, because there's lots of help throughout the CLI and through the different tools we provide. Also, yesterday in Docs, we released the whole AI assistant as well. How do you think the AI assistant will really help with that in terms of the careful reveal?
That's a good question. I'm excited to actually see how people use the AI assistant, like what kinds of questions they're asking, and what sorts of words in the docs they're highlighting, and then asking the AI assistant for more information. I think that'll actually drive a lot of our product development internally. Actually, very early on, we would have an email sent to us for every single error that our users ran into, and then we would try to make those errors not errors, where we try to better document it so that developers don't run into those same errors over and over again. And so I can imagine us doing something similar for the AI assistant, where we're seeing these commonly asked questions and common pitfalls, and then making sure that we're closing those gaps over time. I think the AI assistant is an awesome tool for getting help and for just like asking questions too, and getting a more I do still think it's ideal, though, if you don't have to use it. And if our integration were simple enough that you can, copy and paste 7 lines of code and then just have Stripe working for you in the way that you want. And so that's still the vision. Even if we build all of these tools around the development process, like the AI assistant or like Workbench, the North Star of our API design is still, it is so easy to get started that you hopefully don't have to use all these tools.
So let's touch on that a little bit more, because many companies, and before this I worked at AWS.
Yeah.
AWS, many services get added, and the sheer problem is the complexity this exposes to customers. And the trade-off of that is very hard, because you want the innovation of the services, but not the complexity.
Yes.
And it seems like the navigation here, it takes a very different approach. How do you think about that?
Interesting. I would say that we have added a lot of complexity, frankly, over the last decade or so as we add more features. I think one thing we do want to ensure is that even as we're adding new features, that there are some common primitives that are shared across all of these features so that they work well together. So for example, today we announced Accounts V2, which is the V2 of our Accounts APIs. And with Accounts V2, if you're using billing and payments, but also using Connect or issuing, let's say, you have one representation of your user, so that you can then reuse their identity data, for instance. If you already collected it during the payment flow, you don't have to recollect it if you're using Connect and onboarding them. Or if they are already using Connect and holding a balance for Connect reasons, you can then use payments for that account and then charge that balance directly. And so before Accounts V2, you would have to have a separate customer object and a separate accounts object if you're using Connect, and those would not interoperate at all. So we do think deeply about interoperability as our product suite grows, because we know that what's awesome about Stripe is when the things do work together. Like you can just issue a card to an existing customer, or you can use the balance that they're accruing for other use cases beyond what that balance was originally accrued for. And these are hard problems to solve because it is not easy to get a bunch of different teams to collaborate and to build these interoperable experiences. But it's something that we really hold near and dear to our hearts, is like making sure all of our products actually work well together.
Yeah, and I would just say to everybody, if you're at sessions right now, there is a session today going into API V2 with 2 of the product managers that explains this in a lot of detail. It's a great way to spend 30 minutes to expand your knowledge about how V2 works. But just turning back to this, so I know recently, in the last year, we've created this monthly release strategy.
Yeah.
What was the thinking about that, and why did you go down that path?
Yeah. I guess for a while, or for as long as I can remember before we had that strategy, we kind of just released things ad hoc. And I think that kind of stopped scaling as the company grew and as the complexity of our APIs grew. I think if you looked at our API changelog maybe a year or 2 ago, you would just see random stuff. Like it wasn't really organized. It was hard to tell what was changing. It was hard to tell what additional features we were shipping. It was also kind of random when we decided to make breaking changes to the API. Internally, what would happen is that some team wants to make a breaking change, and then they would in this Slack channel just say, "Hey, I want to make a breaking change. Does anyone else want to make a breaking change?" And then maybe if we get enough people who are interested in making a breaking change, then we would go through the effort of cutting an API version and putting that all together. And you can imagine this just happened at kind of random times throughout the year. And so I think it was a couple years ago, there were many years where we just hadn't made a breaking change because we didn't get that critical mass of teams that all wanted to make a breaking change at the same time. And so from a coordination perspective, it was extremely inefficient, and there were a lot of things that teams wanted to deprecate or behavioral changes that they wanted to make, but they just couldn't because there was not this mass of teams that wanted to make a change to the API at the same time. And so I'm excited about this monthly release cadence because it just gives us more predictability into when those releases are happening, so we can organize around them. And so we can actually create a good change log that tells you exactly what we're adding and why. And then we also have breaking changes every 6 months. And that also gives us an opportunity to have a train that's going to run on time, and you can put your breaking changes on that train, and teams can coordinate around that timeline rather than ad hoc, like raise your hand if you have any breaking changes. So for me, this process really is about scaling how we do API development, and it is still early though. I would say I think there's been some rough edges around these releases because it is a new concept that we are introducing internally as well as externally. But I'm excited for how much more predictability it'll give us.
Now, if I'm a developer as a customer, what does this mean for me? Do you require me to do something every month to keep up to pace, or what should I do?
No, again, these releases aren't going to break your existing integration. Instead, what you can think of is that they will contain exciting new features that are, bundled in a way that's visible to you. Whereas before, we would ship new features all the time, and it would be hard to tell when there would be new features shipped to the API. So I don't think it's actually any different from how you as a developer would experience Stripe before, except now there's more organization around it and there's more predictability around it.
I mean, I very much think you're tackling problems that many people will never face because just the nature of the company growing so fast and the complexity, and you're finding your way through this. But if you rewind back to companies when they're just starting, so many of our customers, what sort of advice would you give to people who are building APIs from scratch? And what mistakes should they avoid? What are some North Star principles they can follow?
I think, again, going back to Stripe in the early days, we've always agonized over API design. Sometimes we spent too long naming a particular API, and we shouldn't have spent that long. But I don't think we've ever regretted really spending the time to think through how our APIs work and how they would scale to meet the needs of users as they grow, but also of the features that we want to add. Because the worst thing for us is if we have to ask our users to migrate because an old API contract no longer is able to support the features that we're adding in the future. So a great example of this is we introduced payment intents back in, I think it was 2017 when it first entered private preview. And at the time we discussed, should we try to put all of these new payments features onto charges? And there were so many features where we just could not figure out how to shoehorn them onto the charges API because it was an API designed for card payments, synchronous card payments. And as we know now, local payment methods are often asynchronous. They often have multiple steps before they're completed. And so the charge state machine just wasn't able to support it in a way that would be good for developers. And so that was a very painful transition from the charge API that everyone knew and loved to this new payment intents API that, to start didn't have any users. All of our users were on the old API. But we've really invested in that over the last many years at this point. And now we can very quickly ship new local payment methods to the payment intents API, and developers on the other end can very easily adopt them with dynamic payment methods. And that's something that wouldn't have been possible on charges. And I would say in 2017, the payment intents, the design process took 3 months of just 4 engineers in a room whiteboarding all the possible local payment methods we wanted to support, all their different states and state transitions. And we spent that time because we knew it was so important. And the worst thing that we could do is create an API that wasn't extensible and then ask our users to switch later on.
So you talked about extensibility, which has been a big theme in a lot of what we've talked about in the keynotes so far. If you think forward the next few years, 3, 4, 5 years, what do you think APIs look like? What do you think will happen in that time frame?
4 or 5 years is tough, especially with everything else going on in the space. I think APIs, I think it'll still be very important to get the right primitives in the API. So things like payment intents, the payment method primitive, how we model balances in the API, how we model cards, for instance. But the way that those APIs will be used will probably change. There will probably be more things that are configured from the dashboard, for instance. We already see a lot of Stripe users not configuring payment methods in the API integration anymore, but using dynamic payment methods, configuring the dashboard. There will likely be more agents interacting with our APIs. But to me, that almost re-emphasizes how important it is to get those primitives right. because those state machines and those data models are how we communicate with within Stripe, but also with third-party extensions, and getting those specs right is still really important.
Yeah. Now we talk to a lot of customers as developer advocates, and they give us lots of feedback. And there's always a thought like, what happens to the feedback after they give it to us? And I always say we give it to the product teams, and it's really important to what you do. But how do you think about that feedback we bring back to you? How important is it to you?
Yeah, absolutely. The feedback is extremely important. We take the feedback into account as we are reviewing new APIs, as we're thinking about changes to APIs, and we also think a lot about like API paper cuts. I talked a lot about like the core domain models and the big blocks of the API, but the little frictions also make a huge difference in every developer's day-to-day. And so absolutely we take that feedback and we incorporate it into the next iterations of our APIs.
Yeah. So lastly, what's the best way for customers to stay up to date with everything that's changing in Stripe? What do you recommend?
Look at our changelog. Now that we have the monthly releases, it will be updated on a predictable cadence with all the new things that we're supporting in the API. I think follow Stripe Dev on X.
Yep.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thanks very much, Michelle. So that was Michelle Bu, who's just really one of the luminaries at Stripe here, and so it's really wonderful to speak to you. We do have that session today on API v2. It'll also be posted to YouTube very soon, so definitely take a look at that. That about wraps our session for now, and we'll see you back here in 30 minutes. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.